Welcome back to Doctrines 1. Again, I'm your teacher, Dr. Benjamin Olson. In today's video, we're going to be looking into the history of the English Bible, or translation, and how it affects the revelatory process. Remember, we began with inspiration as the Word of God came to the prophet or the apostle. Then we looked at the canonicity, the acceptance of those writings by the original people of God at that time. Then we looked at transmission and how the words came from those original autographs down to us today in written form through various copying of manuscripts and all the different things that go along with that. And now we begin our discussion about translation and how and interpretation, and how we take the words that are in the original Hebrew and Greek and translate them into our own language, which in and of itself is an interpretive process. And then we will continue on into interpretation itself. So today, let's just look at the history of the English Bible, going all the way back to its earliest renditions, all the way up to King James, the King James Version. In our next video, we're just going to be looking at the King James Version, and then in future videos, we'll look at other modern translations, and then we'll finish off with a video about interpretation. So beginning with here, looking at the English Bible itself is perhaps one of the most important books in all of history. Not just simply the Bible itself, but the Bible as it was translated into English. And the reason why is because of how it affected the movement of the church in England and eventually in America, which of course spurred the modern missions movement, which spread the gospel all over in Africa, South America, in Asia, China, and all over the globe. And so ultimately it's the English Bible that is very important. Obviously the Bible has been translated into many other languages. I believe that some estimates put it at 1,900 languages, or perhaps even up to 2,000 languages at this time. So let's look at the beginnings of the English Bible. First and foremost, we need to understand that the Bible was not necessarily immediately translated from Hebrew and Greek into English. There were lots of other influences on the English Bible, particularly the Latin. The original Latin translation of the Bible, what's called the Vulgate, was translated by Jerome between 383-405 A.D., late 4th century, early 5th century. That translation dominated for about 1,000 years between 400 and 1400 as the dominant translation of the Bible, which means that it had incredible influence over the Catholic Church, over the Western Church as a whole, and even over modern Protestantism. Obviously, over on the Greek side, the Greek Orthodox Church maintained just the maintained the Greek text as it was, and so didn't have that large influence of a particular translation. And so the beginnings of the English translation, remember, the Catholic Church, the Vulgate was the accepted translation at the time and was not to be questioned. And so most of the early translations in English were done against the will of the Catholic Church. And so many of these original English translators either died or were persecuted severely for their labor. So we begin in 680 A.D. So as early as 680 A.D., a guy by the name of Caedmon, an unlearned laborer, is reported to have arranged in verse from stories of the Bible on subjects ranging from creation to the work of the apostles. Although these verses were not really translations, they mark the first known attempt to put biblical accounts into Anglo-Saxon, which of course was a precursor to English. Then 640 to 709, you have a guy by the name of Aldhelm, made the first straightforward translation of portions of the Bible into Anglo-Saxon, early Old English, shortly after AD 700. Then Egbert of Northumbria became the first to translate the first three Gospels into, again, Old English, not modern English. The Venerable Bede, B-E-D-E, one of the great scholars of Europe, translated the Gospel of John into English. Alfred the Great translated part of Exodus and the book of Acts into English. Aldred, in 950 A.D., a priest named Aldred, left his legacy by writing a word-for-word translation of the Latin between the lines of the Latin manuscript of the Bishop of Lindisfarne. Say that 10 times fast. This thus producing one of the first interlinear translations with Latin and English beside it. The manuscript of Aldred is our earliest evidence of an English translation of the New Testament. Alfric, in 950 to 1020, translated from the Latin the first 7 books of the Old Testament, and William of Shoreham and Richard Rowley, both of these men translated the Psalms into English. Rowley's edition also contained the verse-by-verse commentary on the Psalms. Now let's get into more modern English. And by modern English, we're still talking late 14th century up to the earliest 17th century before the King James. We begin with John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe, sometimes known as the Morning Star of the Reformation, lived between 1320 and 1384. He was responsible for the first full translation of the Bible into English. He often clashed with the Pope and with Rome. Wycliffe believed that the English-speaking people needed their own version of the Scriptures. He said, enlightened Englishmen learn Christ's law best in English. With the assistance of some of his students, Wycliffe translated the Bible using Jerome's Latin Vulgate as the basis for his translation. His work was completed in 1382, and in 1388, Wycliffe's associate John Purvey revised Wycliffe's first version. Wycliffe's efforts were so despised by the Roman Catholic Church that they issued 5 different papal bulls ordering his arrest, declared to be a heretic, burned some of his copies of the Bible, and 43 years after his death, they dug up his remains and burned them again, and then threw them into the river. Wycliffe's version came years before the invention of the printing press. Though done by hand, enough copies were made to survive the attempts to have all of Wycliffe's copies burned. Today, there are some 170 copies of Wycliffe's version that exist, 170 manuscripts of Wycliffe's version that exist. Between 1396 and 1500, this time period brought many revolutionary changes to England and to all of Europe that paved the way for printed versions of the Bible in English, most notably the printing press. The Renaissance brought about the rise of nationalism, exploration, discovery, and literary revival all throughout Western Europe. In 1396 to 1468, Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press, and his first Bible was published in 1455. Then, cheap paper from China was introduced to Europe. In 1458, Greek began to be studied publicly at the University of Paris. The first Greek grammar appeared in 1476, and the first Greek lexicon appeared in 1492 in English. The first Hebrew Bible was published in 1488, followed by the first Hebrew grammar and Hebrew lexicon in 1506. William Caxton, in 1422, from 1422 to 1491 was his lifespan, brought the new printing method to England, and a Protestant Reformation brought attention back to the authority and sufficiency of the Bible. That's when, in 1516, Erasmus printed his first Greek New Testament in 1516. That brings us then to William Tyndale, a brilliant scholar who studied at Oxford and in Cambridge in England. A student of Erasmus, Tyndale spoke 7 languages and was proficient in Hebrew and Greek. Tyndale's aim in life was to give English people a translation of the Bible based not on Latin, but the original Greek and Hebrew. Remember, Wycliffe did his based on the Latin. When challenged by a member of the clergy that Englishmen were better without God's law than with the Pope's, Tyndale replied, "I defy the Pope and all his laws. If God spares my life, ere many years I will cause a boy that driveth the plough to know more of the Scripture than you do." In 1523, Tyndale sought official support for his English translation from the church hierarchy in England. Remember the English Protestant Reformation in England under Henry VIII, but he was denied. Under the sponsorship of some new wealthy merchants, though, Tyndale went to Germany, where he completed the New Testament in February of 1526. 6,000 copies of his New Testament were copied in Worms, which is the place where Martin Luther would be tried at the Diet of Worms, and by April 1526 they were selling copies of the Bible in English in England. Bishop Tunstall of London, however, bought many of these copies so that he could have them burned. Ironically, the money that Tunstall paid off Tyndale's debt with the money that Tunstall bought all those copies with, paid off all of Tyndale's debts and financed a new and corrected edition. So, great job there, Tunstall. Tyndale then reprinted his New Testament many times, and in 1530 he published his translation of the Pentateuch with a revised edition of Genesis, appearing in 1534. Tyndale also translated Jonah and all of the books from Joshua to 2 Chronicles. And Tyndale translated directly from the Hebrew and from the Greek, and truly is the father of the English Bible. 90% of his words passed into the King James Version, and many of those words then, of course, have been and 75% of those words into the Revised Version, and many of those continue in modern translations today. William Tyndale actually was the one who many times would translate words or transliterate words like bishop or the word baptism or angel because of his view of the high level of Greek that he thought was used in the New Testament. He did not want to translate those words, but rather transliterated them into an anglicized version. Tyndale's translations were unpopular with church authorities since his work was unauthorized, but he put the Bible into the hands of most of the common men of England. Tyndale lived with English merchants in Antwerp in relative safety until he was betrayed and arrested in 1535. After a year and a half of being imprisoned, he was burned at the stake in Brussels on October 6, 1536. His last words were, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." There are several other printed copies we're going to talk about here. Just very quickly going to cover them. Miles Coverdale's Bible was a friend and associate of Tyndale, was responsible for the publication of the first complete English Bible in printed form in 1535, which of course is just before Tyndale's death. Coverdale used the translations of Tyndale and translated the rest of the Bible for himself. And then Coverdale, however, in his translations, used the Latin rather than the Hebrew. So there's times where his translation used the Hebrew, or used the Latin rather than the Hebrew, to cover up for all the places where Tyndale left out parts or hadn't translated yet. Within 1 year of Tyndale's death, complete English Bibles were available to all the people of England. Then you have Thomas Matthew. His actual name is John Rogers, but went under the name of Thomas Matthew. Published his own version in 1537 by combining the Old Testament works of Tyndale and Coverdale, along with the 1535 revision of Tyndale's New Testament. This translation also included 2,000 marginal notes that he had written, since he was an associate of the declared heretic Tyndale. Rogers used the pen name Thomas Matthew in his version. Rogers was burned at the stake during the reign of Bloody Mary Tudor, Mary the First of England. Richard Taverner. Taverner's Bible was a 1539 revision of Matthew's Bible. Then you have the Great Bible, 1539. Another revision of Matthew's Bible was published called the Great Bible. This was edited by William Coverdale. It was the first of the English Bibles authorized and read in the churches. As it was the wish of Henry VIII that it go abroad among the people, and in keeping with the king's wish, a copy of the Great Bible was placed in every church in the land. People flocked eagerly to the churches to see the Bibles which had been set up for reading, and at the time the preachers complained because the people chose rather to read the Bible than to listen to their sermons. Tyndale's dying prayer at last had been answered, that the Lord had opened the eyes of the King of England. Then you have the Geneva Bible with the Roman Catholic Bloody Mary Tudor on the throne of England. Some English Protestants fled to Geneva, where they produced a new translation, the Geneva Bible. The main force behind the Geneva Bible was a guy by the name of William Whittingham, who was a colleague of John Calvin. The Geneva Bible was an improvement of the previous English translations. Its translators were scholars who were able to make revisions to the original languages, or from the original languages. It was, hold on a second, just lost my place here. It was also the first translation to use chapter and verse arrangements, print each verse as a separate paragraph, and put words not found in the original text in italics, which is a common practice today in most translations. The Geneva Bible was also small and moderately priced, which meant that it could be copied and sent to many of the churches around England. In fact, this was the version that was preferred by the Pilgrims when they came to America. Then you have the Bishop's Bible. When Elizabeth I came to the throne of England, she required every parish church to have an English Bible. Since the Geneva Bible was not accepted by English clergy because of its controversial Calvinist notes, another more acceptable version came into being, the Bishop's Bible. Its name came from the fact that most of the translators were bishops of the Church of England. Bishop's Bible was basically a revision of the Great Bible. Its quality, though, is not as good as already very popular Geneva Bible, and failed in rivaling the Geneva version. No more copies of the Bishop's Bible were made after 1602, though. It continued to be the official version of the church until the 1611 King James Version. All right, our final version we're going to look at is the Dewey Reams version, otherwise known as the Catholic English Bible. This was translated 1582 after the Council of Trent, and the English Bible was translated there into English by the Catholic Church, and that version also had a fairly dominant effect on the King James Version. I apologize for the length of this video, but there was a lot of versions we needed to talk about there. So in the next video, we'll talk about the history of the King James or Authorized Version.